Welcome to Lesson 3 of the Creative Prayer Book. I'm Eric Scott, and each week I'm bringing you different lessons, different ideas to work in little sketchbooks to create some type of prayer book, some type of affirmation book, some type of whatever you want to do in your own book. But this is just a little book that I got. I've mentioned before that I won it from Stillman & Birn. It was a very interesting kind of format, a 3.5 by 5.5 inch landscape format book. Before we dive into the lesson today, I do want to share with you something that I've done over the last couple weeks, and that is to create my own little book. I'm not a bookmaker. I haven't done much bookbinding, but I looked at some simple bookbinding, some simple bookmaking tutorials online, and I came up with this little booklet. It's a pamphlet stitch. If I can do it, anybody can really do it. So what I've done is I've taken some very high quality Strathmore mixed media paper. It's their 500 series, and I've used 6 different sheets, and I've cut them down to approximately, I think, 5 by 7. And so I took 6 sheets of that, and then I used a watercolor cover. This is a little bit heavier duty watercolor paper, and I just used warp thread as the thread to bind it. I didn't do anything special, just a simple pamphlet stitch. It took like 15 minutes to do it, so I just wanted to share that is an option. That is something to try out if you don't have access to a little book like that. So just to kind of recap what I've been doing, in the first week, in the first lesson, I did a lot of watercolor, and so I have watercolor, and then last week I did pencil and collage. So I have quite a few pages started in my little book. I'm not too worried right now about what's going to go on these, but today we're going to use some other materials that we're going to add some more layers to it. So I'm really about layers. I love doing layers. I use a lot of transparent materials, so watercolor pencil, tracings, image transfers, and stuff like that. So we're going to do a lot of that, and then we're going to get into some of the meaning making. But I did want to take a moment and talk about how I am thinking about, because I do want to start thinking about the contents. What's going to go in this little book? And I want to be thinking about that now and maybe starting to gather some of that. So like I said, for me, I'm not a religious person, so I'm not going to put actual prayers in there, but feel free to go in and do that. I'm looking at this as an affirmation, as a reminder. So I have some things that I actually did these, wow, I don't know how long ago. So I had some index cards, and I sat down one day and I just started writing all these phrases. This was years ago, so these have been sitting around the studio, and I think at first I was thinking about like, oh, these could be sort of cards, maybe, I don't know exactly what I was going to do with them, but I think now I know exactly what I want to do. So I went through and I made a bunch of these. So tell your stories, be where you are, stop complaining, and like I said, I have a whole bunch of them, just a bunch of cards, and I actually glued some of them into my current journal. So I don't know exactly how many I have, but I know that I might use these as the prayer, as the mantra, as the affirmation that I want to put in my book. So I'm envisioning later being able to put some of those words and phrases. Maybe it's just one that goes across the 2-page. Maybe it's, you know, each spread has 2 of them. I don't know. I still haven't figured that out, but I wanted to share that. So what I would encourage you to do is to sit down, maybe use paper or use some index cards and start thinking about what you might want to put on there. Maybe it's your favorite song lyrics. Maybe it's quotes that are motivational to you. So start thinking about that, and then over the coming weeks we'll talk about how to incorporate them in. So anyway, today I want to turn to probably my all-time favorite material, watercolor pencils. So I have Prismacolor watercolor pencils. They're a premium brand, but like anything, use whatever you have. And even water-soluble crayons. So watercolor crayons can work with this, but I always have watercolor pencils. So I have the Prismacolor, and a lot of times I use Derwent. And I love the Derwent Inktense. Technically, they're not watercolor pencils. They're water-soluble ink pencils, but I'm going to use those. And I'm going to use these in two main ways. And so I'm going to add to the pages and maybe start some new pages. So I have my watercolor, I have some pencils, I have some other stuff up there that I've used before, and of course I have my water cup. Let me just push that kind of out of the way. So anyway, so what I want to do is to use the watercolor pencil to create some structure. So I use some of these pencil lines to create some structure, and I have some rectangles and things, but I want to add to that. So I don't want to go real dark, so I'm not using the darkest blues. I'm not using really dark browns or dark greens yet. So I have this terracotta color, which is kind of a light brown. So I think on here, what I want to do is to create structure is to reinforce what's there. So I can add some rectangles and some squares, and that's going to help to create structure. That repetition helps to tie things together. And what I like to do, this is a technique I use a lot, is I don't color in the shape, I actually go on the outside. So if I shade and color around the outside, then I can spread water and the color will spread outwards. So maybe I want to do another one over here. And then maybe a big one over here. So I have this piece of newspaper. Right now it kind of stands out. So if I take it and maybe draw right into it, I can create a larger rectangle. And again, I'm shading or coloring the pencil on the outside of my shape. And this is just something that I do a lot of. It's a technique, kind of like a trademark. No, I have not legally trademarked it, so feel free to use it. But it's a way that I've developed to use the pencils. Now I do want to bleed the edge. I mentioned that last time. This notion that things can go off the edge. So maybe I can put a rectangle at this edge. Maybe I want one down here. So by going over top of the collage elements, that's going to start pushing the collage down into the page. And then maybe I want one up here that's going to straddle the center. Okay, so there are lots of techniques to use these pencils. I'm going to do it a simple way. I'm just going to use plain water. So if I take a paintbrush, I don't want anything too big, and I dip it in my water, then I'm going to brush it over. And since the pencil is water soluble, the color is going to spread out. But because I shaded it into the background, the color spreads into the background and the inside of the rectangles stay. Like I said, this is just a technique that I like, and it really creates a lot of structure in the page. And I'm not a big fan of squares and rectangles, but I use them all the time because my paper tends to be rectangular, and so rectangles and squares and straight lines help to divide the space and help to really create the structure. So I'm going to do this with all of these rectangles and shapes. I'm not worrying about being super, super neat. I'm not worrying about it being, blended out really carefully. It's okay if it's streaky or if it's dark in areas. I think a lot of times we get really caught up in like, oh, it has to be very neat and pristine, but really, who says so? I mean, it doesn't have to be. And actually, that kind of look, that sort of what a lot of people call wasabi. What is it? Shoot, just totally forgot about it. Wasabi? No, that's wabi-sabi. That's there you go. Wabi-sabi. Wasabi's the hot sauce. Anyway, so now I have this kind of all spread out, and that's a way to add another layer. And I'm going to let that dry, or in this case, I'm going to use my hair dryer, and then I'll move on to other pages. Okay, so now that this is done and it's dry, I'm just going to leave it and I'm going to move on. Just like everything else, I can do every page or I can skip pages. This is just something that's going to add some variety and some layers. But I want to get into how else I can use the watercolor pencil. So this creates a lot of structure, so I'll use shapes and do that on lots of other pages, but there's another way that I like to use the pencil, and that's to create textures on it. So I have up here some of the things that I've used before, this Punchinella, and I used this with the watercolor before, but now I'm going to use it with the watercolor pencil. And so by using it as a stencil, I can draw in there. So I've got some yellows and some greens, so I think I'll stick with the green. I've got this lighter grass green, and I'm going to trace. So if I trace, now I'm not going to do every circle. That would just take a really long time, and I don't want to drive myself crazy. And I'm trying to press kind of hard, not super, super hard, but just enough to get some pigment down. And like I said, I'm just kind of jumping around doing random circles. It's okay if they're next to each other, but I don't have to fill in every single one. It's nice if some of them go off the edge. And I'm not worrying about, again, making them perfect circles. So if the circles are a little bit off or a little bit lopsided, not a big deal. Okay, so after I get a few of these down, then I can pick it up. So you can see I have all these circles. Now I'm going to just brush water over it. So this way it'll kind of blend more into the background. So this is kind of the second way that I'm going to use the water color pencils, is that I can spread. You can see how it's a little hard to see, but it's spreading that green around, so it sort of dissolves the circles a little bit. It kind of fades them out. And so maybe I want to add some over here to keep it balanced. And again, by doing it on top of the collage, it's going to help push the collage into the page, so it's not kind of floating on top. So if you've ever done anything and you felt like you glued in something and it really looked like the piece that you glued in was just kind of floating on top, by adding material, color, paint over top of it, you can help push it down onto the page. Okay, so I've got some more there, and then I'm going to do the same thing, just sort of spread it around. And just like before, use my hair dryer. Okay, so I'm just going to keep working with the watercolor pencil, but those are the two main ways. There are lots of other techniques for working with the watercolor pencil, so feel free to use those. These are the two main ways that I use them. the techniques that I come back to again and again. So I'm just going to flip through, and I might be like on here, this makes sense that maybe I'll go around the pencil marks. That could be something to do. Maybe on this one I want to do more texture on it. Pages like this, definitely I can add more to it. So anyway, just kind of wanted to share that idea of maybe making your own book, especially if you haven't quite started doing this yet and you want to get into it and you don't have a book or you haven't gotten out and bought one. You can always make one. Also wanted to talk, like I said, about thinking about the affirmations, the prayers, the content that you're going to put in your book. And then finally, just to show you some watercolor techniques to help build more layers into it. So that kind of wraps it up for today. I'm keeping these very simple, easy lessons that we're slowly building up into this book, because I'm a big believer that small actions will accumulate into very complex, layered pieces. So thank you for joining me again, and come back next week for lesson number 4. So thank you and happy creating.